Louis Armstrong transformed jazz in the 1920s and gave it direction and purpose. He remains one of the most important figures, changing the nature of the soloist ensemble. Louis Armstrong was born in New Orleans, where he learned how to play the cornet and evolved as a musician. Starting off with a rough childhood, he was able to pull through and was mentored by his hero, King Oliver. Famous for his virtuosic abilities, he quickly climbed to the top and started a new era of jazz, known as the swing era. When mixing his New Orleans style with Fletcher Henderson's Broadway style, he created a type of music that had more rhythm to it. By establishing his performances and recordings, the 1920s served as a basis for improvisation and virtuosic solo playing. He was able to set the standard, as a famous jazz trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie said, "Know him, know me." Louis Armstrong was born August 4th, 1901 in New Orleans, Louisiana. Armstrong was left under the care of his grandmother until he was able to start school. At that point, he lived with his mother. This only lasted until the age of about 7, when he was taken in by an immigrant Jewish family. Whilst living with his new family, Armstrong began to develop musical ear by singing in a street barbershop quartet. His step-parents enabled him to buy his first cornet. Around the age of 12, Armstrong committed a crime which put him in the home for colored waifs in general delinquency. This may seem to have been a setback for young Louis. However, it ended up being a place where his interest in music blossomed. He continued to play the cornet and was given lessons by a professor. After his release, 14 months later, he joined a band, where he worked all day hauling milk and coal while playing at night. While playing in this band, Armstrong progressed through the practice in musical education. Armstrong rose to fame in the early 20s. His mentor had been Joan King Oliver, a famous cornetist of the time, who left Armstrong in 1918 to play in Chicago. After moving on and playing in other bands, Armstrong's musical skills began to grow immensely, and he started to become very famous. When the word hit Oliver, he immediately offered Armstrong a position as a second trumpet in his band. Armstrong jumped at the idea. Oliver might have been his mentor, but he could not keep up with Armstrong's talent as a soloist. His virtuosic abilities awed jazz enthusiasts, and word quickly spread. Performing with Oliver was short-lived when Armstrong married Lil Hardin, who persuaded him to play with Fletcher Henderson in New York. Not only was joining this band a step for Armstrong, it was the start of a new era of jazz. Louis Armstrong, the beginning and the end of music in America, said Bing Crosby. In other words, as I see it, Armstrong ended one jazz era and started a new one. Fletcher Henderson, the leader of one of the most esteemed dance halls in New York, taught Armstrong composition and music terminology. By playing in the band with Henderson, he was able to directly manipulate the sophisticated sound of the dance hall jazz to give it something more rhythmical and upbeat. On Broadway at Rosewood Ballroom, Armstrong incorporated the classic New Orleans sound to a popular jazz. After hearing his talent and unique rhythmical improvisation, it was evident that Armstrong was undoubtedly the best jazz soloist Broadway had to offer. He steered jazz towards the more fluid rhythms of swing. In the 1920s, Armstrong performed with a number of different musical groups and began to revolutionize the jazz world with his introduction of the extended solo. Prior to his arrival, jazz music was played either highly orchestrated arrangements or in a more loosely structured Dixieland-style type of ensemble, in which no one musician soloed for any extended period. Musicians everywhere soon began to imitate his style, and Armstrong himself became a star attraction. His popularity was phenomenal, and throughout the 1920s, he was one of the most sought-after musicians in both New York and Chicago. Armstrong's Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings remain to this day some of the best and loved of the time. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, Armstrong maintained one of the most grueling continental tours of all time. He began playing with the large bands that were popular at the time, but soon realized that his style was better suited to a small ensemble. With the help of his manager, Joe Glasser, he formed Louis Armstrong and his All-Stars, the band, which had a rotating cast of all-stars, including Jack Teagan, Barney Bygard, Earl Hines, and Big Sid Catlett. Though many believe the 40s marked the beginning of the decline of Armstrong's playing, the recordings bear out his continued technical proficiency, spirited interpretations, and the depth and soul of his playing during those years. The 1950s proved to be integration for Armstrong as both musician and a public figure. Though he had been singing since the early days in Chicago, it was not until the 1950s that audiences recognized his remarkable skill as a singer as well. His rough and throaty voice became almost instantly the internationally recognized voice of jazz itself. His 1956 recording of Eliza Fitzgerald of George Gershwin's Porgy and Bess was one of the most popular and best-loved duets of the 1950s. For many, his scat singing was the perfection of a genre that then in its infancy. With its increasing fame, however, came the criticism of a black community that felt he was not living up to the responsibilities of his times. The late 50s brought with them the civil rights movement, and many blacks saw Armstrong as an Uncle Tom playing for primary white audiences around the world. Though adamant with these claims were unjust, Armstrong was then in his 60s and primarily concerned with continuing to travel and perform. Armstrong spent the final decade of his life in the same way that he spent the four previous, entertaining audiences throughout the world. In 1971, he died of a heart attack in New York City. Though the history of jazz is filled with many exceptional and innovative musicians, it is hard to find any one who has had as profound of an influence on the movement as Louis Armstrong. Armstrong's legacy is more than simply his virtuoso trumpet playing, which for nearly every trumpet player since seems intubated, but his great formal innovations as well. His commitment to the search for new forms in jazz and his continued heartfelt performances will remain a major symbol not only for the musical life, but the entire cultural life of the 20th century America.